The man known to history as Vidkun Quisling was born on the 18th of July 1887 in rural Fyresdal in the Telemark region of southern Norway. His full name at baptism was Vidkun Abraham Lauritz Jonsson Quisling. His father was Jon Lauritz Quisling, a pastor of the Church of Norway. Jon was born in 1844 and had spent much of his early adult life unmarried. It was while lecturing in the town of Grimstad on theology and other subjects in the late 1870s, by which time he was in his mid-30s, that he would meet Vidkun's mother. The Quisling surname is an unusual one and was derived from Quislinus, the Latinized version of Quislin that an ancestor chose to adopt 2 centuries before Jon's time. Jon Quisling had an interest in the burgeoning field of genealogy or family history, one which his eldest son adopted, with Vidkun in later life even inventively managing to trace the Quisling's family origins back to the Norse god of war, Odin. Jon was also an author and spiritualist, best known for writing a 3-volume study entitled The Souls of Angels, a work which, among other endeavors, garnered him a reputation for being Norway's foremost authority on demonology. Vidkun's mother was Anna Carolina Bang, the daughter of a Norwegian shipping magnate who was the most affluent businessman in the town of Grimstad. She was only in her late teens when she met Jon Quisling, and they did not marry until 1886, after a long courtship, by which time Jon was in his 40s. Vidkun was their first child. 3 others, a boy named Jorgen, born in 1888, their only daughter named Esther, born in 1893, and a 3rd boy named Arna and born in 1898, would follow. Vidkun and Jorgen were initially raised back in their father's native Fyresdal, where Jon and Anna had relocated to from Grimstad after they were wed. Around the time Esther was born in 1893, the Quislings relocated to Strømsø, a district in the town of Drammen, where Jon had been appointed to act as a local minister. Vidkun's formal education began here, attending a local school. He was seemingly bullied here on account of his family's outsider status, and he may have been relieved when his father was yet again moved, this time to the town of Skien in the Telemark region in 1900. He continued his education there, displaying interest in a wide range of subjects, notably history, philosophy, and the natural sciences. Despite challenges in his schooling early on in Drammen, the Quisling's family life was a seemingly warm one. One gets the sense of a home environment that prioritized discussion of religious and spiritual topics from a Christian perspective, and Jorgen Quisling, Vidkun's younger brother, would many years later go on to write philosophical tomes on anthropomorphism and on how the world had been created. Vidkun was also unquestionably an extremely intelligent teenager, and he would perform brilliantly in his studies through his youth and young adult years. Vidkun grew up in a period of major transformation in Norway's politics, history, and society. When he was born in 1887, Norway was effectively under foreign domination as a constituent part of the Kingdom of Sweden. Indeed, the country had been under foreign rule for many centuries. It was a long time since Norway's glory days, but it had gone through a golden age as far as Norwegian nationalists in the 19th and 20th centuries were concerned. Back in the 8th century, the Norse people had begun expanding out of Scandinavia, the Baltic Sea Islands, and the Jutland Peninsula to launch raids on and begin conquering and settling places like the Faroe Islands, Britain, Ireland, northern France, Iceland, Greenland, and down the rivers of Eastern Europe. The centrality of Norway to the Norse migrations and conquests is clear insofar as we often collectively term these people as Vikings today, a term quite probably derived from the Viken region surrounding the Oslo fjord in southern Norway, though the etymology of the term is disputed. What is not disputed is that Norway was largely united under a sole king by the 10th century, and in the 3 centuries that followed, there were numerous kings of Norway that ruled vast territories around the North Sea. The peak of this imperialism was when King Håkon IV, in the mid-13th century, controlled Norway, Iceland, outposts on Greenland, many of the islands surrounding Scotland, and was even offered the High Kingship of Ireland. Quisling would grow up to become a Norwegian nationalist who looked wistfully back on this perceived Norwegian golden age and even fancied his family as being descended from St. Olaf, the Norwegian king who began the conversion of Norway to Christianity. If Håkon's reign had been a golden age for Norway, what followed was the nadir of the country. In 1397, Queen Margaret of Norway had agreed to the Kalmar Union, a political union between the crowns of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Through it, Norway was gradually subsumed politically under Danish power. Sweden left the union in the early 16th century, but Norway remained under Danish domination for nearly 3 centuries thereafter. When the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century afforded it an opportunity to reach for its independence, it succeeded only in swapping Danish domination for Swedish overlordship. Stockholm's control would always be contentious. The middle decades of the 19th century saw a further growth in nationalist sentiment across Europe, and the Norwegian nationalism that had seen the split with Denmark initiated only grew in strength under Swedish rule. By the time Quisling was born, substantial powers of self-government had been granted by the Swedes to Norway to placate nationalist sentiment. Even as the country experienced considerable economic and social problems, leading to a huge wave of mass migration to the United States, where Norwegians settled in large numbers in the Great Plains. Finally, after efforts to reform the government and put Swedish rule on a more stable footing failed in the 1890s and early 1900s, the Swedes finally agreed to grant Norway its independence in 1905. Hence, just as Vidkun was entering his adult years, Norway acquired its independence for the first time in over half a millennium. Yet it was a comparatively poor and marginal European power, and many Norwegians, Quisling among them, would spend the first decades of independence contemplating how Norway could further its place in the world and better the lot of the Norwegian people. In 1905, just as he turned 18 years of age, Quisling gained entry into the Norwegian Military Academy, an institution which had been founded in 1750 and lays claim to being the oldest school of higher education in Norway. A year later, he transferred to the Norwegian Military College in Oslo, a more elite officer training school for those who would command artillery divisions, the engineers, and the Norwegian Navy. In both instances, the Military Academy and the Military College, Quisling scored some of the highest entry scores since the history of the schools, and was even granted a meeting with King Håkon VII so that the king could congratulate him on his achievements in this regard. Ironically, Quisling would later play a role in the shutting down of the Military College in 1940. He continued his studies here until 1911, at which time he was sent to join the General Staff of the Norwegian Army, the command corps of the military. This was a relatively important organization. While Norway was a small country of not much more than 2.3 million people at the time, its long history of domination by its Nordic neighbors had impressed on the Norwegian people the need to be able to defend itself after independence. When this was achieved in 1905, a system of compulsory national military service was in operation, resulting in the Army General Staff serving an important function in Norwegian life in the early 20th century. Quisling was still pursuing the early stages of his career in the Norwegian military as Europe hurtled towards war in the summer of 1914, as a result of escalating tensions over the assassination of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo by a Serb nationalist. The Norwegian government had adopted a strategy of strict neutrality following independence in 1905, unless the country's vital interests were threatened. It was not associated with either of the two major military alliances in Europe, and so when the First World War commenced in the final days of July 1914 and the first days of August, Norway remained outside of the conflict. Quisling was opposed to neutrality, believing that Norway's national interest could be served by strategic involvement, and he generally deemed remaining aloof from the fighting, whichever side Norway might join, as cowardice. That said, Norway was hardly entirely aloof anyway. It retained close economic ties with Britain, overlooked extensive British use of Norwegian waters as part of the war at sea, which never fully materialized in the First World War, and allowed itself to be coerced into limiting supplies of many goods to Germany as the war went on, such that Norway has been termed the neutral ally of the Entente powers, Britain and France. During the First World War, Quisling was assigned to begin examining the war on the Eastern Front, as well as Russia's military. There certainly wasn't much positive to report on in terms of the Russian Imperial Army, a fighting force which, despite having huge manpower reserves, was enormously inefficient and suffered major defeats to the Germans in Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe between 1914 and 1917. Norway's reasons for wishing to observe the Russian war effort were reasonably obvious. The government in Oslo, being wary of the emerging European superpower, one which had already claimed control over Finland in Scandinavia a century earlier at the time of the Napoleonic Wars. Norway and Russia shared a border at their northern extremities. Quisling's existing knowledge of Russia ensured that when the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917 and the Bolshevik communists seized power in St. Petersburg and Moscow, the former of which had been renamed Petrograd to avoid it having a German-sounding name during the war, and then later was renamed Leningrad by the Bolsheviks, he was assigned to the Norwegian legation in Petrograd to observe how the newly formed Red Army was conducting itself in the Russian Civil War that had broken out even as Russia exited the First World War. He spent much of 1918 either in Petrograd or observing events from the slightly safer haven of Helsinki in Finland. It was the beginning of a decade-long period in which Quisling spent much of his time in Russia and other parts of Eastern Europe. In the course of 1918 and 1919, Quisling began to admire the Soviet system, which he saw developing in Russia, and the potential of it. One of his reports back to Oslo stated of the Red Army and the Soviet cause that there was, quote, tremendous strength in such revolutionary masses once mobilized. He was particularly impressed by the manner in which Leon Trotsky, one of the most able leaders of the Bolsheviks, had managed to galvanize support for the revolution through an immense propaganda campaign and had turned the Red Army into a crude but effective fighting force, one which, over time, managed to achieve victory in the Russian Civil War out of an initial situation in which the Russian Empire had literally been falling apart from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean in 1918. Yet the more he observed, the more Quisling became disturbed by the violence that had enveloped all parts of the Russian Empire, writing from Finland in 1919 that class warfare had been initiated by the Bolsheviks. His fear of the same thing entering Norway would shape much of his political outlook for the rest of his life. While Quisling was playing a role as Norwegian observer of the Russian Civil War and diplomat there, the country was slipping into a famine, which he would play a role in trying to alleviate. By 1921, the Civil War had been underway for over 3 years, and while the Soviet Red Army was finally beginning to defeat the broad coalition of whites that opposed it, the conflict had caused enormous devastation across Russia and other regions such as Ukraine, the Caucasus, and Poland. The epicenter of the fighting eventually became the region around the course of the rivers Volga and Don, south from Moscow to the Caspian Sea, and east towards the Ural Mountains. It was here in 1921 that an appalling famine began, aggravated by a particularly warm spell of weather that created drought conditions and led to a collapse of agricultural output, exacerbated by disease outbreaks such as cholera and typhus, and logistical issues around labor shortages and transport. The famine was appalling in some places, and in some provinces such as Samara, cannibalism became widespread. An estimated 5 million people, over half of all the casualties of the Russian Civil War, died because of the famine in 1921 and 1922, photographs of which are particularly harrowing even by the standards of the cauldron of death that Europe became in the first half of the 20th century. Quisling would soon be involved in relief efforts to try and bring food and aid into Russia to the regions which were worst impacted on by the famine. He was contacted and asked to join this work by Fridtjof Nansen, a fellow Norwegian who had been appointed by the newly established League of Nations, the forerunner of the United Nations, to act as the League's High Commissioner for Refugees. Inevitably, this role soon saw him focusing on Russia and famine relief there. Nansen was a famed explorer of the heroic age of Arctic and Antarctic exploration, having led an early expedition to find the North Pole in the mid-1890s. He was able to utilize his fame to draw attention to the plight of ordinary Russians during the famine and acquire extensive international funding to aid in relief efforts. Despite his later crimes, Quisling's role in Nansen's efforts should not be trivialized. He produced a very extensive report on the situation in Russia, which laid out in detail how at its worst, the famine was leading to the deaths of upwards of 10,000 people every day. What was most striking about the report was the suggestion that if things got worse, upwards of 30 million lives were at risk. The work of Nansen, Quisling, and others did not stop the famine, but it did lead to some significant redistribution of goods and realignment of political thinking in Europe towards the situation in Russia at a time when governments in places like London and Paris were brushing aside the humanitarian crisis as being the fault of the Russian people themselves. Nansen noted the hypocrisy of living on a continent where people were starving on one end of it, and on the other, foodstuffs were being produced in such abundance that governments were trying to work out ways of using the surplus as biofuels. Quisling oversaw efforts to end such waste, and operating from Ukraine, was the chief administrator in 1922 of bringing in food relief to Western Russia. Nansen was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize at the end of 1922 for the efforts of the team he led in Eastern Europe. Quisling's time in Russia certainly led to him having a complicated personal life in the mid-1920s. Despite being a zealous Christian, Quisling had managed to acquire not one, but 2 wives in Russia, certainly a dispensation that most established Christian churches would frown upon. The first of these was Alexandra Voronina, a 17-year-old girl who was operating as a switchboard operator in Ukraine when Quisling was in charge of relief efforts for Nansen there in 1922. He married her in August of that year, though he would always maintain, and extant correspondence from the 1920s would seem to confirm it, that he married her only so that she could acquire a Norwegian passport and get out of Ukraine during the period of immense turbulence in Eastern Europe. Yet the relationship also seems to have been sexual, and in the course of 1923 she became pregnant. Alexandra would later claim that Quisling pressured her into having an abortion. What further complicated matters was that in September 1923, just over a year after his marriage to Alexandra, Vidkun married Maria Pasechnikova, another Ukrainian woman considerably younger than him, though older than Alexandra at nearly 23 years of age when they married. These marriages, if they can both be termed such, given the illegality of polygamy, created quite a complicated situation for Quisling as he prepared to leave Ukraine in 1923, following his humanitarian and famine relief work there. Quisling decided to take an early retirement from the Norwegian military at this juncture, and with his pension, he, Alexandra and Maria moved to Paris, where he spent much of his time, writing on the Russian Revolution and various religious and philosophical topics. There he described Alexandra as being Vidkun and Maria's adopted daughter. The subterfuge worked fine in France, but when they briefly headed home to Norway, family and friends looked askance at the peculiar ménage à trois that the pastor's son was at the center of. The situation only resolved itself when Alexandra went back to France to visit an aunt who lived in the city of Nice in 1925. She had no contact with Quisling from the late 1920s onwards after moving to the Far East, although the marriage was not annulled until the 1930s. Despite the dubious legality of their union, Vidkun and Maria lived as husband and wife in a more conventional manner after Alexandra departed for France in 1925. In Norway in 1925, Quisling needed to find a new line of employment. He once again collaborated with Nansen in a project to aid Armenians, a people who had suffered a dreadful genocide inside the lands of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War, to settle within the Soviet Union, where the Civil War had ended some years earlier and which was entering into a period of considerable economic and social rejuvenation in the mid-1920s. The work saw him spend much of his time in the second half of the 1920s in the Caucasus and Eastern Europe. It was only a part-time endeavor, and Quisling was also involved in various business ventures in Russia during these years, often providing advice on the local markets and culture to individuals who wished to try to turn a profit during the post-war reconstruction of Russia. Sometimes this could cause controversy, such as when Quisling was one of several individuals accused of currency fraud in Russia, charges which remained unproven. More certain was that Quisling had been defrauded himself. During his many years in Eastern Europe, he had acquired what he believed were numerous valuable paintings by some of Europe's greatest painters, such as Rembrandt, Goya, and Franz Hals. There had been such paintings floating around on the Russian art market in the late 1910s and 1920s, ripped off the walls of the salons of Russian aristocrats at the time of the Revolution, but the paintings Quisling had invested a substantial sum of money in were fakes. When he learned this many years later after returning to Oslo permanently at the end of the 1920s, it did much to foster his anti-Semitic views, believing that the art dealers involved had been Jewish. Like so many other figures who would become notorious leaders of European states during the Second World War, Vidkun Quisling's entry into frontline Norwegian politics came about as a direct result of the Great Depression. The impact of the Wall Street crash and the shock to the Western financial and economic system was not immediately felt in Norway in the autumn of 1929, nor indeed were its worst effects apparent either in 1930. Instead, it was not until 1931 that the most severe period of the Great Depression set in, as the full extent of the European banking crisis became evident. The state of affairs was compounded when the worst effects of the Great Depression did set in by the fact that Norway was not an especially affluent country in the first half of the 20th century, decades before petroleum would transform it into one of the wealthiest nations on earth. There had already been labor strikes in some sectors of the economy in 1928, a rarity during the Roaring Twenties. This also pointed to the buoyancy of the labor movement in Norway, and the 1920s had seen a distinct rise in popularity for both the Norwegian Labour Party and the Communist Party of Norway. This earlier discontent was massively compounded during the Great Depression, as unemployment moved steadily upwards, peaking in December 1932 at around 13%, though concrete figures are difficult to establish in a country where farming and fishing, often of an unofficial kind, were major parts of the economy. Overall, it had been suggested that Norway was the worst impacted of the Nordic nations by the Great Depression, creating an environment which was ripe for political instability and the development of more extremist political views and parties. While he had been involved in political life and held governmental positions of a kind for many years in Russia and elsewhere, the crisis of the early 1930s saw Quisling's entry into frontline politics. By the beginning of 1930, he was in contact with several Norwegian political figures he had come to know over the years about forming a new political grouping in Norway. Their initial foray was a party called Norsk Aksjon, meaning Norwegian Action. Prominent here was Fredrik Pritz, a man Quisling had become acquainted with while in Russia and who would later serve as Minister for Finance in the collaborationist government of the 1940s. Norsk Aksjon would prove abortive as a political party, but its platform pointed towards where Quisling's politics were heading. It was right-wing, nationalist, and corporatist in its outlook. That there had been a considerable shift in Quisling's politics was indicated in its anti-Bolshevik and anti-communist outlook. Figures like Quisling by the early 1930s were worried about Norway's proximity to the Soviet Union and the rise of the communist movement in Norway, topics that Quisling explored at length in his book Russland og vi, Russia and Ourselves, published in 1930. This book established Quisling as a prominent political commentator, and his profile within Norwegian politics grew very quickly as a result. It also highlighted a distinct shift in his views towards a more racial approach to Norwegian politics, in line with the growing scientific racism of the interwar era. The period after the publication of Russland og vi saw Quisling move through several different political iterations, seeking a home for his political views. For instance, he joined the board of the Federalangslaget, or Fatherland League, a right-wing, nationalist, corporatist and anti-communist Norwegian political party that had been founded in 1925 by Christian Michelsen, the first Prime Minister of post-independence Norway, and Quisling's old Russia ally, Fridtjof Nansen. He was also the leading figure in the formation of the cumbersomely titled Nordisk Folkereisning i Norge, a name transliterating as Nordic Popular Rising in Norway. In this, he had the title of Führer, the Norwegian version of Führer, a title meaning leader, which would infamously become associated with Adolf Hitler in Germany once the Nazis seized power there in 1933. Quisling would only remain a member of the Nordic Popular Rising for a very brief time, as just weeks later, he was approached with an offer to serve as the Minister for Defense as part of the Farmers' Party or Agrarian Party in the new coalition government that emerged in conjunction with Labour in 1931. Quisling's military career and views on the Soviet Union made him a prominent enough figure that he was brought into the government fold. His 2 years as Minister for Defence between May 1931 and March 1933 would prove controversial, as he promoted a radical policy platform and clashed with the heads of the government on several occasions. This would lead him to leave office in the spring of 1933, with the intention of forming a new radical party, one which again was primarily corporatist. The timing was notable. When Quisling left the government and established what was called Nasjonal Samling, National Gathering, in the late spring and early summer of 1933, Hitler and the Nazis had just come to power in Germany, and many corporatist and fascist parties were on the ascendant in Central Europe. The policy outlook of Nasjonal Samling is hard to easily categorize. It was in line with Quisling's political views of the 1930s, insofar as it was corporatist, right-wing, nationalist and anti-communist, but it could also be said to have a fascist edge, with its emphasis on racial hierarchies and the cult of leadership which Quisling would try to develop around himself. Other aspects of their platform were less controversial. A perusal of the 30-point plan, which was issued as the party's policy platform in February 1934, shows an overwhelming focus on economic and labor reform to create a buoyant middle class. Agriculture was to be promoted through the economic support offered to smallholders, while education was to be more widely available, and class conflict of the kind actively fostered by the communists was to be opposed. Christianity was to be protected as a national religion, while the Norwegian media and cultural institutions were to be used for propaganda purposes and to mold national unity, an approach which was entirely common in the 1930s, even in countries like the United States, France and the United Kingdom. As a platform, there was nothing overly radical about what Nasjonal Samling seemed to be proposing at this early date, but its message certainly did not resonate with the Norwegian people. Despite high hopes of its success based on Quisling's high profile, it failed to make any breakthrough in electoral politics in the mid-1930s, and did not return candidates to the Norwegian parliament after elections in late 1933, in which it garnered just over 2% of the vote nationally. Nasjonal Samling had done poorly in its first electoral performances on a relatively familiar right-wing, anti-communist, corporatist and nationalist platform. It was only in the years that followed, as further dismal electoral performances piled up, that Quisling started to move towards a more unequivocal fascist stance, with an overt emphasis on his position as leader of the party and also an emphasis on a more rabid form of anti-Semitism. In this, Nasjonal Samling deployed the common trope of associating communism and Bolshevism with Judaism, perpetuating the common conspiracy theory of the age that Marxism or communism was an ideology that formed part of a dastardly Jewish plot to dominate Europe. This was pure fantasy. Unhappily for Quisling, in Norway people saw through it in a way which they had not in Germany and other countries, and in the 1936 parliamentary elections, Nasjonal Samling's vote share fell from where it had been only 3 years earlier to just 1.8% of the vote. Despite the inherent disinterest of the Norwegian people in his approach, Quisling and Nasjonal Samling would continue in the same vein into the late 1930s. It should be noted that while there was always a sense that Nasjonal Samling were a fellow Nordic version of fascism in Norway, there was little coordinated contact between Quisling's movement and the German Nazis during these years. Quisling did not constitute a German fifth column within Norway in the pre-war years. It would take the outbreak of war for him to become a dangerous element of this kind. Even as Nasjonal Samling was putting in its dismal showing in the 1936 elections in Norway, the Nazis were rapidly rearming in Germany, and Hitler was pushing forward the timeframe for igniting a pan-European war to take over much of the continent. In March 1938, the Anschluss with Austria was effected, and 6 months later, the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia was annexed. The rest of Czechoslovakia was dismantled and absorbed into the growing German Third Reich in the spring of 1939. Finally, with Central Europe having been conquered without firing a shot, the German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939 led to Britain and France declaring war on the Nazi state. Norway's position from the very beginning of the Second World War was important. The country's huge border and strategic position within the North Sea and North Atlantic meant that the country and its ports were of major importance in the impending naval war between Britain and Germany. If the Germans were to defeat Britain, they would either have to choke off its supplies from without or else engage in an amphibious invasion of Britain itself. Both of those approaches would require a naval war in the North Sea, one in which control of Norwegian ports like Bergen and Narvik would become very important. Thus, while Norway would try to remain neutral in the Second World War, as it had in the First, Norwegian neutrality was under threat from the very inception of the war. Norway's neutrality was not just under threat from Germany. Within weeks of the war commencing in September 1939, discussions were underway in London for the British to invade Scandinavia and take over neutral Norway and Sweden, a plan which would allow the British to secure Norway's ports and Sweden's iron ore supplies, the latter of which the Germans relied on the trade of to feed their war economy, while control of Norway and Sweden would also allow Britain to send aid to Finland after it was invaded by the Soviet Union at the end of November 1939, as part of the short-lived Nazi-Soviet alliance. The plans for the invasion of Norway in particular were very well advanced, and Plan R4, the British code name for the takeover of Norway, was very nearly initiated in the spring of 1940. However, before it could be launched, the Germans preempted the British. On the night of the 8th of April 1940 and into the early hours of the 9th, German divisions strategically attacked key cities and ports in Norway, with a small fleet entering Oslo Fjord and both amphibious and airborne parachute units landing into Narvik, Bergen, Trondheim and other locations. The Norwegian government and military was completely unable to deal with even a minor invasion force, and Oslo fell to just 1,500 troops. A British-French expeditionary force opened a front in the north of the country, but it only managed to offer limited resistance in the weeks that followed, before withdrawing. The Norwegian royal family fled to London, and Norway came under German occupation. There is something of a fundamental misconception surrounding Quisling, one that holds that he was complicit in some very significant way with the Nazis in initiating the takeover and occupation of Norway. This was actually not the case. He had been in contact with the Nazis prior to the invasion of his country in April 1940, and had looked for their aid in potentially establishing him as dictator of Norway, even visiting Berlin to meet Hitler in mid-December 1939, 3.5 months into the war. But he seems to have largely been rebuffed, and what might have occurred during the meeting with Hitler remains almost entirely speculative. This caveat aside, once Norway was invaded, Quisling did quickly become the willing stooge of the Germans. He rather rapidly was in contact with various individuals within the Nazi regime, and by the 10th of April was drawing up a list of individuals who might serve as ministers in the government he would form. Even then, his potential position as head of a puppet regime was not guaranteed, and in the days that followed, various other options were under consideration. It was only when Quisling emerged as the most biddable of the proposed candidates, and King Haakon VII took the decision to head into exile in Britain in early June 1940, that Quisling's star suddenly became in the ascendant. By the autumn, he was the unofficial head of the collaborationist government and had appointed most of the cabinet ministers. Quisling would serve as head of the Norwegian government for nearly 5 years, down to the end of the Second World War in May 1945. However, he was far from an all-powerful figure. While he was head of the domestic government, Norway was a country under German occupation. Therefore, Quisling's position was always subordinate to that of Josef Terboven, the Reichskommissar for Norway, for over 5 years between April 1940 and May 1945. A German politician, Terboven was an old Nazi hand, one who had been a member of the party since its earliest days and had been involved in the beer hall putsch in Munich back in November 1923. Figures like this were rewarded for their loyalty during the war by promotion to important positions, and as Reichskommissar, Terboven was effectively the governor of Norway under Nazi occupation. Quisling had considerable authority, but he was not the most senior figure in the regime here, and indeed much of his direct engagement with Hitler and the senior Nazis in Berlin involved negotiations about when Norway might be granted its independence from German military rule, something which was never feasibly going to be granted until after the Second World War, and then only on a very conditional basis, if at all. As head of the collaborationist government, Quisling moved with his wife Maria into Villa Grande, a mansion which had been built by Sam Eder, the head of Norsk Hydro, one of the country's largest companies back in the late 1910s, and subsequently was bequeathed to the Norwegian government after a rapid changeover of owners in the 1920s. Here they presided over a Norwegian fascist court of sorts, with Maria hosting gatherings of some of the most prominent individuals of the Nazi and Nasjonal Samling regime. They named the residence Gimle, the name of a celestial land from Norse mythology, where the survivors of Ragnarok, the great battle at the end of days, would reside as a sort of paradise of the worthy. It was a choice of name which was indicative of the self-perception Quisling had during the war years. There is no denying that Quisling was a busy individual here. He would often rise very early and carry out several hours of work from home before heading to the office at the Royal Palace in Oslo for about 10 a.m. He was a taciturn figure to those who knew him during this time, often quiet, bordering on mute at social gatherings at Villa Grande, but less guarded and more talkative in small groups. To others, he seemed paranoid at times and could have substantial mood swings. He was not, however, stupid, as some people would try to make him out to be after the war. Whatever his moral failings might have been, Quisling was very well read and knowledgeable on a wide range of subjects, from German and Nordic religion and mythology to Christian exegesis and Western philosophy and rationalism, while also having an interest in Asiatic cultures. Quisling's position was somewhat unofficial for the first year or so at Villa Grande. It was not until the 1st of February 1942 that his position was properly formalized, when he was declared to be appointed as Minister-President of Norway. By that time, Nasjonal Samling was virtually the only political party in Norway, beyond the Nazis of course, which had any legal standing. Nonetheless, despite the privileged position it enjoyed, membership of the party would never go much above 40,000 people, an indication of how disinterested ordinary Norwegians were during the occupation in playing along with the collaborationist party. As head of state, he tried to pursue an independent and presidential line, visiting Berlin on state visits to press the case for greater Norwegian autonomy and trying to build up national solidarity through organizations such as a Nasjonal Samling version of the Hitler Youth in Germany. Despite such efforts, he remained an unpopular figure, even during the period of the war when German victory seemed inevitable and Norwegians might have expected that through an alliance with the Nazis they could benefit in the long run. Life in occupied Norway under Quisling's government was peculiar in many respects. Though seldom noted, this was actually the most militarized region of the Third Reich in terms of the ratio of German soldiers and military personnel to civilians. There were over 300,000 German soldiers in a country of slightly less than 3 million people, meaning that for every 9 Norwegian civilians during the war, there was 1 German soldier here, a product of Norway having such a long coastline to defend and being host to several major naval bases. The south of the country also became the center of the German heavy water program, a project to develop nuclear capabilities using deuterium atom-containing heavy water, something which Norway, with its fjords and hydroelectric dams, was an ideal country to play host to. Living conditions declined for ordinary Norwegians as occupation robbed Norway of much of its export markets in Britain and elsewhere, and many people resorted to subsistence garden agriculture and keeping livestock in their backyards or gardens to make ends meet. Things would become worse from 1942 as the German economy ran into difficulty and more Norwegian produce was requisitioned and sent to Germany. These were all factors which explain why Quisling and Nasjonal Samling were never able to generate more support between 1940 and 1945. Of course, life was worse for some Norwegians under Nazi rule than for others. As a northerly part of Europe, far away from the Mediterranean, Norway had never been a major center of Jewish settlement in medieval times, and the Jewish population of the country stood at just over 2,000 people when the Nazis occupied the country in April 1940. It had been lower still a decade earlier, but about 350 Jewish people had immigrated from Germany and Austria to Norway to escape Nazi persecution in their home countries in the 1930s, only to have the Nazis follow them to Scandinavia. Anti-Jewish laws were imposed by Quisling's government and that of Reichskommissar Terboven from the summer of 1940 onwards and intensified over time. The Nazi final solution, which ushered in the Holocaust, only officially began early in 1942, and Norway was not a priority for those who oversaw it. Consequently, widespread arrests of the limited number of Jewish people in Norway did not take place until the autumn of 1942. In the course of just a few days, the 26th and 27th of October and the 25th and 26th of November, hundreds of Jews were detained in Oslo. They were eventually taken to the Donau ship, which transported them to Germany, from whence they were transported by train to Auschwitz-Birkenau. In total, nearly 800 Jews in Norway were detained by Quisling's government. Of these, only 34 survived the war. The rest were murdered, mostly at Auschwitz. The others that were never detained were more fortunate. Owing to Norway's enormous border with Sweden, over 1,000 Jews, slightly more than half of the Jewish population in the country, were able to slip over the border and into neutral Sweden, a country which maintained close economic ties to Nazi Germany, but which displayed a considerable humanitarian approach to Jewish refugees, once the extent of Nazi persecution became apparent as the war proceeded. Quisling was wholly complicit in the Holocaust in Norway, and whether by deportation to Auschwitz or flight to Sweden, Norway was a country with virtually no Jewish residents in it by the time the war ended. Quisling also oversaw efforts to stamp out the Norwegian resistance movement. Once again, Norway's long border and strategic importance made it a major center of resistance efforts. The Norwegian government in exile in London was able to work with the British government to organize special operations to strike at targets within the country, and Norway was the site of more Allied special operations missions during the war than any other occupied European country, barring France. These included missions to knock out the Nazi heavy water nuclear program at Vemork hydroelectric power plant through Operations Grouse, Freshman and Gunnerside in 1942 and 1943. Quisling clearly had a role to play in trying to curb resistance activity and the frequent saboteur missions against Nazi bases and installations across the country, and earned him more than a few rebukes from Berlin. Nevertheless, the Norwegian resistance only became more forthright in their actions as the war went on, and German resources in the country were stretched thinner and thinner. By 1944, with German soldiers being moved from Norway to France, the Eastern Front and Italy, resistance groups were proliferating, often setting up bases in the forests from which they struck at the towns and cities. There was also a growing movement to socially ostracize Quisling and anyone associated with him in government. A distinct element of Quisling's political views by the early 1940s, and something which partly explains his willingness to collaborate with the Nazi occupation forces, was his own paradoxical nationalism. Quisling believed after the Second World War broke out that an alliance with Germany might be a means to make Norway into a much greater power than it was at the time. In this sense, he looked back towards the medieval era when Viking warlords had conquered much of the North Sea world and kings of Norway had ruled over places like the Faroe Islands, the Orkney Islands and Iceland, and had even forged close ties to regional Norse rulers of parts of England, Scotland and Ireland. Some of his political ideology harked back to this time, and Quisling hoped that in his return for his complicity in the German war effort, Norway would eventually be relieved of the German occupation and rewarded by Hitler. To this end, he had made clear his desire to be granted the Faroe Islands one day, which were under British occupation since 1940, as well as the Orkneys and Shetland Islands, and even parts of the Outer Hebrides in western Scotland when Britain was eventually defeated, as well as pressing claims to the Kula Peninsula, parts of which lay in northern Finland and northwestern Russia. In fact, in 1944, Quisling even attempted to convince the Germans to invade neutral Sweden, a move which he hoped to benefit from by acquiring the province of Jämtland for Norway. The proposals even extended to include parts of Greenland, the Arctic, and Antarctica at their most elaborate. These highly ambitious designs of building a Norwegian maritime empire aside, by the time Quisling was proposing an invasion of Sweden, it should have been clear to all that there would be no German victory in the war for Norway to benefit from. While the year and a half after the occupation of Norway had seen the Nazi Third Reich continue to expand through the conquest of the Low Countries and France in the summer of 1940, and then the invasion and conquest of significant parts of the Soviet Union in the summer and autumn of 1941, the advance stalled outside Moscow in the early winter of that year. The United States entered the war that December, and in 1942, the possibility of German and Axis victory collapsed as Germany's resources began to decline, even as the Allied war economies expanded and millions of men were conscripted. By the time 1943 dawned, the result of the Second World War was not in doubt, only how long it would take to end it. Throughout this time, there was serious consideration given by the Allied leadership to the possibility of liberating Norway in order to further the British maritime battle against the Germans in the North Atlantic. In the end, though, other strategic imperatives were always chosen as better uses of Allied resources, and Norway would remain under German occupation, with Quisling as the head of the collaborationist regime until the end of the Second World War in 1945. The liberation of Norway would only finally come about through Operation Doomsday, a military operation that the British 1st Airborne Division carried out between the 9th and 11th of May 1945. This was actually several days after the end of the Second World War in Europe. Like several other parts of Nazi-occupied Europe, such as the Netherlands, the Allies had simply decided to not invest the necessary resources into liberating Norway towards the end of the war, it having ceased to have any major strategic significance once the naval war in the Atlantic had broadly come to an end in the final months of 1944, and the heavy water nuclear program was firmly scuppered. Through Operation Doomsday, British units landed into sites around Oslo and other cities. The German occupation forces and the Norwegian military knew that the war was over by the time the British arrived and surrendered in droves. The operation was still viewed as necessary by the British to limit Soviet influence in the country during the post-war reconstruction of Europe. When the liberation began, Quisling did not attempt to flee. He surrendered himself and was imprisoned in Oslo, where he began preparing his legal defense for the impending trial he would face. It was a less dramatic end to the war than his superior, Josef Terboven, the Reichskommissar of Norway, had. Terboven had reacted to news of the German surrender on the 8th of May by detonating 50 kilograms of TNT in his bunker near Oslo, with himself inside in the bunker. Unsurprisingly, he didn't survive. Quisling's trial was held quite quickly after the war ended. It commenced on the 20th of August 1945. The leader of Nasjonal Samling was fairly philosophical about it, stating that he knew very well that he had already been found guilty in the court of public opinion. Still, he maintained a bizarre confidence in his own righteousness, asserting that in future years he would be viewed as a latter-day St. Olaf, the medieval king of Norway who had begun the conversion of the Norwegian people to Christianity. His defense during his 3-week trial focused on the argument that he had not handed Norway over to the Germans, but instead had chosen to collaborate with the Nazi regime in the hope that over time he could bring about Norwegian independence by conciliating the Germans. At one juncture he stated, quote, "I have in all my thoughts and deeds been led by love for the Norwegian people." Those who sat in judgment of him were not convinced, and on the 10th of September he was found guilty of a wide range of crimes, including overseeing and abetting the Holocaust in Norway, in one of the earliest post-war convictions for the genocide of the Jewish people of Europe during the war. He was sentenced to death by firing squad, a sentence which was carried out on the 24th of October in Akershus Castle in Oslo. A white target was pinned over his heart before the execution was carried out, which the executioners were to aim at. His last words, according to Kjell Juel, the commander of his guards, were, quote, "I have been judged unfairly. I die innocent." Afterwards, his remains were cremated and scattered over his native Fyresdal. Quisling's trial and execution was just the most prominent element of the backlash against those who had collaborated with the Nazis in the post-war months and years. Over 50,000 people were eventually tried and convicted of aiding the German occupation in one way or another, though just over 24 were deemed to have committed such treasonous acts that they were executed. The country was fortunate that Churchill had argued strongly for keeping Norway within the Western sphere of influence after the war, and in return for concessions from the British and Americans elsewhere in Eastern and Central Europe, the Soviets withdrew military units which had occupied parts of northern Norway, back into Russia in the autumn of 1945. Once the initial post-war reconstruction was complete, Norway emerged as a buoyant liberal democracy. The country began an ambitious program of hydroelectric power development and prospered. This strategy became especially beneficial from the late 1960s after huge oil fields were discovered in Norwegian waters in the North Sea. The development of the Norwegian petroleum industry thereafter transformed the country into one of the richest in the world, bolstered by the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Oil made Norway the prosperous, strong nation that Quisling had foolishly believed it might become through collaboration with the Nazis. Vidkun Quisling's surname has become a synonym in the modern world for collaboration with a foreign agency to the detriment of one's own nation or group. For instance, some of the leading officials of the communist regimes in Eastern and Central Europe during the Cold War were termed Quislingers for their acquiescence to directives from Moscow, which often went contrary to the interests of their own nation. This is certainly a relevant synonym to use, but at the same time, it risks simplifying Quisling's own career. A Norwegian expert on Russia who contributed to humanitarian programs there during the Russian Civil War, he became a proponent of Bolshevism in the 1920s before changing course to espouse a uniquely Norwegian version of the far-right politics of the 1930s, one which promoted Norwegian agriculture, Christianity, self-sufficiency, and Norwegian nationalism. It warrants mentioning that Quisling's humanitarian work with Fridtjof Nansen saved far more lives in Russia in the early 1920s than lost their lives in Norway in the whole of the Second World War, though this certainly doesn't excuse Quisling's later actions. His great failure was determining Norway could thrive through collaboration with a German Third Reich, which he believed would win the Second World War. All he ultimately achieved was the occupation of Norway by a foreign power for half a decade that morally compromised Norway during the Second World War. He was a bizarre nationalist who betrayed his own nation. What do you think of Vidkun Quisling? Was his approach towards the Nazis more complicated than is often appreciated, or is the fact that his name has become a synonym for collaboration with a foreign enemy entirely justified? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.